This is a production of Cornell University.
In a Chats in the Stacks book talk at Cornell University's Mann Library, landscape architecture professor Paula Horrigan provides highlights from her new book, Service Learning in Design and Planning. Linking professional work and social change, the book radically revises the standard protocol for university-initiated design-build projects in the community. As a collection of case studies by design educators, the book critically explores the current practice of community-engaged learning in architecture, landscape design, and urban planning.
Okay, thank you, Marjorie and Lynn. Where's Lynn? Somewhere here. Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for this invitation today. Yeah, and I see lots of my students here. Thank you guys for coming. This is a busy time of year, and I have many colleagues too, and friends, and thank you all for coming today. I'm going to start with a little show and tell. Okay, now, I promise this is not a cooking show. All right, I am here to give a book talk. But I'm going to start with this pizza pan. All right, starting with the pizza pan. Now, this pizza pan stands for the academy and for the environment of the academy. Now, we could say it's the geography of a campus like Cornell University. So we have a geography known as the academy. But we also have a sort of bigger geography that we think about the academy in general. It occupies a terrain, a geography of thinking and thought. There it is. Just like all cooking shows, you can't have everything there at once. Okay, so what do we do in the academy? We create knowledge. We construct and create knowledge and ideas in the academy. This is a very rich terrain, this geography, where knowledge occurs. A lot of us here, we're part of that community and that environment. Knowledge occurs and is created and debated within the academy. It's a rich and important terrain for knowledge. Now, one of the things about the academy often is that we construct knowledge, but we also think of ourselves as occurring within this kind of internal geography. And we privilege knowledge to a great extent. We assume that that which we create within the community, within the academy, is more important than other knowledges. And in fact, and we know this from the academy, we often construct a kind of hermetically sealed environment around ourselves. So knowledge gets enclosed within this boundary. In fact, the thickening of our knowledge and our capacity as academic thinkers means that a lot of this quality of that boundary gets thickened and created. But there are other forms of knowledge. The community. There's also knowledge outside the academy. And that knowledge occurs in the world that we all inhabit and live in. And a lot of times we think of it as actually, we even think about it as being something outside the knowledge that occurs in the academy. It's orbiting around the academy. It's out there. It's vibrant and it's alive. I had some colleagues tell me about 2 years ago that in the academy, we construct the ideas and then we shoot them, that knowledge that we conceive and construct, we shoot it out into the world. This is my representation of shooting knowledge out. And in fact, I'm a visual thinker. You can already see I'm a landscape architect and I'm a visual thinker coming from fine arts. So I actually, in this discussion where my colleagues started to describe how we invent the knowledge and then we actually shoot it out into the world, I, of course, started doodling little rockets on my pad and started thinking about, well, that's very interesting that we have kind of defined this geography where we think that most knowledge occurs within the academy and we actually do most of the invention and the creativity. Then we shoot it out into the world and we hope that it'll get applied and have impact on the community around us. But what if? What if we started to think about this boundary as something different? Whoa, my light went out. Oops, we got a problem. These are always problems with illumination. What if we thought of that world as that boundary as being more perforated and actually was a permeable boundary? It was a boundary where there was actually knowledge coming from outside in and knowledge coming from inside out. when we start to think about that boundary as a different kind of boundary, not one that is thick and which is hermetically sealed and separate, but one that's actually shared and perforated and permeable, I think we start to think about it, us, and how we occur as academicians in concert and in relationship with community. I think we start to think about that in a different way. And what to me is really interesting is that when we start to think about this boundary as being permeable, we think about exchanges. That becomes really important. Knowledge from without enters in, knowledge from within enters out, and we start to see ourselves in relationship to one another. And what to me becomes even more interesting is that if then we think about a lot of the structures within the academy that reinforce the way we think about where knowledge occurs, like our curriculums, our classrooms, our styles of discourse, the way we represent ideas, those things are also constructed within that geography. When we start to think about this as a permeable area, what if we start to relocate the kind of exchanges to the edge and to the boundary? And this is one of the things that I'm particularly interested in, is that if we think about the boundary as being a rich and engaged area where community and academy come together, then we need to start thinking about what happens at that boundary. So what might a classroom look like when it's at the boundary? What might a pedagogy look like? What might a curriculum look like? What might a research approach or practice look like? And this is what this book that I'm telling you about today is really about. It's really about locating education to this boundary, and particularly in our disciplines, which are the design disciplines of landscape architecture, architecture, and planning. I have other colleagues who say, well, how about interior design and some of those other disciplines as well? And we're not concerned about being exclusionary. Yes, we are all individuals and groups and disciplines that work with the built environment, and we work with environments where people and communities, neighborhoods come together and perform their everyday life. So how can we think about, as designers and design educators, about that very fertile ground, that boundary between the academy and the community in a new way, and think about how we invent our pedagogy to respond to it? So that's really what this book that we developed is about. And what's interesting, it's called Service Learning in Design and Planning, Educating at the Boundaries. That's where this title comes from. And that's where this sort of theme or concept that is kind of driving it is coming from, is from this kind of exploration and desire and on so many of our parts to sort of relocate education to that boundary, and also to suggest that we need to both learn new habits of practice, new habits of education, new habits of research, new habits of even defining our discipline that are going to enable us to engage effectively at that boundary. So we need to teach our students differently. We need to think differently about what practice looks like. We need to think differently about how our disciplines perform. We need to even think differently about what theories and practices should inform the way we behave in those environments. So what happened here was that a group of us came together around 2007, I believe, and we started a project called the Erasing Boundaries Project. I'm going to hold up props. I feel like I am giving a cooking show here, holding up props. But we started a project called the Erasing Boundaries Project. And again, this came out of the fact that many of us who've been engaged with this kind of work in architecture, landscape architecture, and planning have ourselves been marginalized. We've been considered some of the academicians and practitioners who are also seen as occurring at the boundary. Boundary of our disciplines, boundary of our curriculums, boundary of our departments. So we were anxious to form a community of our own where we could support one another and actually build knowledge together around how to be effective in our education practices, in our research practices that engage with communities. So we formed a project called the Erasing Boundaries Project. And this actually came through a grant from Learn and Serve America, which was trying to encourage disciplinary networks. So a group of us came together, 4 different institutions in the Northeast, and came together and founded this project called Erasing Boundaries. What we've done since is that we've actually engaged in a series of different things that we've done together. We're developing a case study project. We've held 2 major conferences, which were peer-reviewed invitations that involved landscape architects, architects, and planners. We brought our peers together. We began to explore this subject and our teaching and our practice and our research. And we then started to create some artifacts and some knowledge from that dialogue. So what you're seeing, or what I'm talking about today, basically is the outcome of our first Erasing Boundaries project of coming together and developing what became our initial meeting, first conference, and then this represents basically the papers that came out of that conference. We've just gotten our book contract a week ago for our second volume, which will come out of this. So this has been a really important thing for us to kind of build a new culture from within of designers and educators involved with design, to build a new culture from within that begins to explore what are the possibilities for this kind of education, what are some of the pitfalls, what are some of the obstacles that we're facing in trying to basically educate our students and also engage in design that occurs at the boundary where academy and community come together. So the book is basically organized into 4 major chapters. And those, again, came out of the 29 contributors are actually part of this book. I have 2 co-editors. One of them is Tom Angotti from Planning at Hunter College. The other is Cheryl Doble from ESF in Syracuse. And we developed, basically, we came across 4 major topical areas that kind of came out of our dialogue. And you have to also realize that we put out a kind of provocative statement to our peers when we did this. And we asked, how can we overcome boundaries created by our own pedagogical strategies, professional education, disciplinary autonomy, and academic curricula in service to community and academic service learning? So people really responded to our question. They very much responded to this concept of boundaries, because as I've described it, there's a lot of, I'm sure there's all kinds of questioning going on in your head. Well, what is she talking about, these boundaries? And boundaries are places of connection. Boundaries are places of crossing. Boundaries are places of contestation. Boundaries are places of exchange. And many of our peers said we need as much to acknowledge boundaries as we may want to not to erase them. Do we want really to think about erasing boundaries as much as acknowledging and understanding and becoming conscious of them, so that therefore we can act in more effective ways by understanding that. And you look at the literature on boundaries, there's a lot of work out there about this. So it was been a very provocative subject. We called ourselves Erasing Boundaries. It got us into a lot of trouble. And again, we've kind of kept that name because, again, the provocative dialogue and exchange that comes out of that terminology helps us to kind of be attentive to those kind of issues. So in this particular book, we have 4 key subject areas. The first subject is that came to surface or challenge that we basically saw us facing was this whole concept of seeing the other, of really understanding who is the other, how do we exchange with others, and how do we define the other. Second category was really about reflection and evaluation. And I know some of my colleagues in here are very involved with service learning as a pedagogy. So one of the critical components of service learning is reflection and evaluation, because the adage is, what if you had the experience and you missed the meaning? We're really interested in how people learn from these dynamic exchanges with communities where they're co-learning together. So it's really crucial and integral that we reflect on what's learned, and then we also use that to interrogate and question how we want to move forward and what we really need to know. Because we get, when we get educated at the boundaries, things get messy, unpredictable. I have several students in my studio sitting in the room. We have 24 students working in 4 community projects in Utica, New York this semester. And they can all attest that we think we're doing one thing, and frequently we are redirecting and changing direction in response to the emergent aspect of our dialogue with real people and real places. We can't always predict how those exchanges are going to work out. The third subject is called crossing borders. And we actually have quite a few people in our field who are actually literally crossing geographic borders and working internationally. So that brings, and I know there's some of you here who do international work, so that brings up a whole other dimension, and especially when we're involved in community engaged design, we're involved with architecture, we're crossing those kind of geographies and borders. There are many advantages to them, but then there's other dimensions that come into play in terms of political and social and cultural realities. The fourth category is about confronting academic boundaries. And all of us who are academicians, we know that we are bound to an academy that has ways of performing and behaving. And it's all institutionally structured in terms of how we think and we construct and we conceive how knowledge is exchanged. We also have in our fields, all of us who are engaged with the built environment, we have disciplinary boundaries. So we have disciplinary boundaries between architecture and landscape and planning, interior design. We have, those things are also apparent in our academic boundaries. Frequently we are individually accredited by our professions. So we're accountable to different requirements within our disciplines. It makes it often even harder to cross boundaries. So we're confronting academic and disciplinary boundaries all the time. And several of the authors in this volume are proposing different strategies for how to develop that. Colleagues in Australia are kind of ahead of us in some cases of actually institutionalizing at a much larger level. In the faculty of the built environment in Australia, they've actually designed a full capstone experience for all students across all of their disciplines to work together on community projects. It's a totally different way of thinking about how to interact with communities and how to value service learning and engagement as a critical aspect of people's learning, so that any student who comes from one of those different disciplines in that particular college is going to come out with a sort of equivalent experience of working with communities. They say this is important to their learning and education. I have to say that all the people in this volume too, we share a desire to sort of think about the possibility for design to address issues of social inequity and justice. So we have very much a shared passion around that. We believe that if we can engage our students in critical work with community partners where there is need, we may also help to shape different kinds of practitioners, people who are more reflective and sensitive to the issues and dimensions of communities and real places that they can't otherwise experience when most of their coursework happens in a studio in the geography of the university. So we're really interested in that. We're also interested in perhaps making a contribution to redirecting our students who have these kind of experiences to do other kinds of practice. They may do public practice. They may do practice working with nonprofit agencies or organizations. They may invent modes of private practice that engage collaboration with others. They may take on more a different kind of dimension or way of behaving in practice. So a lot of us are very interested in the fact that we are not totally bound again to the idea that there's a one-size-fit-all type of landscape architect or planner. We're interested in being able to expose our students to different options within the world that they're going to be part of. I should ask if anybody has questions too. If this is if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to ask. Okay, so and how much time do I have for? We're doing okay, Lynn, right? We're at the time. Okay, great. So I got like 20 minutes. All right, so I wanted to share with you some of the things from this book. And I guess another couple things about this too is, this has been a lot about us developing a community of academic peers and partners who are doing this kind of work. Our second conference we just had was called Community Matters. So again, we're tackling different issues that surface around this. But one of the things that's really happened is that we've created a peer group around the country. I've actually been on 7 different tenure reviews in the last 3 years where I've been asked to review my peers at other institutions who are doing this kind of work. Because again, we're trying to create a community of peers and scholars that can help us evaluate and support one another. In my particular professional group, the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture, we've actually developed a track called Service Learning. So we actually now have a whole separate track within our annual conference where we're actually reviewing papers that relate to this. At the Environmental Design Research Association, we've developed a network as well. So we see a lot of this work starting to make connections. The Imagining America conference that's upcoming in the fall here in Syracuse, New York, not far away, we're actually going to have a national call for exhibition around engaged projects coming from architecture, landscape architecture, and planning. And Imagining America is now adding design. I don't know if people have heard of Imagining America. It's called Artists and Scholars in Public Life. And now they are actually adding design into that. So artists and designers and scholars in public life. And so they've really created a national conversation about the role of art and design and the humanities in public life. So we're also going to have a presence at that. So this has been a big outcome of this, is to create this community and begin to develop both support for one another and as well as knowledge as a result of it. So I just want to share with you a couple different pieces from this. I was going to type all this out, but this is my structure to get through some of these different things. I wanted to start with my colleague, Sally Harrison, who is she's a professor of architecture at Temple in Philadelphia. And she emphasizes this concept with her students and with her community partners. She's been working for many years with the Village of Arts and Humanities in North Philadelphia. And she emphasizes this concept of problem seeking versus problem solving. And the idea that through this engagement working with community partners, she is actually endeavoring on collectively defining and understanding what the needs are and the problems are at hand. So this is always one of the dilemmas, in design education or teaching. We want to start out with the brief. This is what you're going to do. This is where you're going to end up. By 14 weeks from now, the product will be up here. That's a little bit harder when you're working in concert with communities. And part of your way of behaving is to uncover together what the problems and needs are. And then from that, then derive a solution. So she talks about this as really being something she calls problem-seeking approach. And that she's actually trying through the course of her engagements where her students are working with community partners to create a new kind of attitudinal space, a different way of thinking, like what your attitude is toward the design that you're the design and the conversations around the environment that you're having. And she's very attentive also sort of to digging into this human landscape, that the human dimension is really what she's trying to get at. So I'll just read you a couple little pieces from her. And this is her talking. If anybody ever been to Temple, it's right in the middle of Philadelphia. And it's not many blocks from North Philadelphia. But that doesn't mean, it's just like Cornell, students don't necessarily go downtown. And if you're at Temple, it doesn't necessarily wander to North Philadelphia. So in spite of being under the gaze of the architecture building, North Philadelphia's neighborhoods have figured little in the mental maps of the students. Mostly the students sustain a generalized concept of the decaying urban context, an undifferentiated, troubling landscape functioning on the margins of their studio-focused life. For those of you who don't know about studio-focused life, all of us who are part of design and planning and arts education, we spend a lot of time in what's called the studio. The studio is a place where a lot of collaborative thinking and exchange goes on between students and faculty. So we have this culture of studio where there's a lot of dynamic exchange, but studio, when it occurs with community, looks different because obviously community doesn't necessarily come onto campus. So, but the Village of Arts and Humanities and the community where it is situated has inspired our imagination. A self-built network of parks and gardens woven into the interstices of North Philadelphia's deteriorating residential fabric, the village asserts that decay and loss open the possibility for beauty and innovation. This particular place and the polymorphous carnival of everyday life that infiltrates it have offered to the students a complex local narrative and a threshold for learning about design in the contemporary city. From the architectural school, students now regularly tread a path north to the Village of Arts and Humanities. With this ritual, they craft a continuous spatial bond that connects their experience of the university and the neighborhood, expanding, if not erasing, boundaries. Up 12th Street they walk, past the newish housing that abuts the campus, and as they approach the City Recreation Center, they see the basketless hoops and cracked concrete pavement. They pass a stretch of row homes that stand in various states of disrepair across the street from an imposing stone railroad embankment. Through the underpass, they emerge into the open space of Fodderell Square. The two high-rising housing towers we can see from the studio stand at its south. The students cut diagonally across the square. So that's the description of the sort of spatial relationship to a community that otherwise students wouldn't have any engagement with, except that here's a teacher who's actually proactively engaging her students with the community. But it's never easy. And this is what unfolds in this whole chapter as you hear her story. The students were admonished to consider the frame of reference for their study and to dig deeper into the human landscape, to ask why conditions were so, and to see if they could identify emergent patterns that might suggest regrowth. They began to value their own time differently, spending it inside the neighborhood in the company of various members of the steering committee, seeing the place through local eyes. They experienced the vitality of Germantown Avenue at street level, the diversity of its commercial enterprises, including a plethora of sidewalk vendors, the density of pedestrians, buses, and cars. They visited the barber shop and nail salon, were introduced to building owners who gave them access to vacant floors, interviewed shop owners, elders, and community leaders, measured streets, and observed the intersection of local and citywide activity at the corner of Germantown and Lehigh. Through trial and error and with the support of the community, the students had begun to master what Richard Sennett calls the craft of experience as a means to design. The students began to see problems from the problem's point of view. Small, everyday things, rarely admitted to the lexicon of the studio, were valorized as design problems, often providing thresholds into more difficult terrain. So then Sally kind of gives us some, and there's a lot of stories in here. Again, those stories have those roots toward an exchange or an engagement with the community that you think is going to start one way and ends up with students working with neighborhood people and developing murals on one of the most marginalized streets and developing a festival that started to regenerate the neighborhood and collectively working with the community to develop strategies and solutions. So what Sally says in conclusion here is that the human landscape is a critical source for design, yet it cannot be fully experienced in the traditional studio setting where most design instruction takes place. This is a hole in our design education that is beginning to be filled. As an alternative way of teaching and learning, direct and sustained engagement with the community can be a powerful force in the intellectual and affective lives of students and faculty, and it presents a challenge to our inherited studio culture. The community-based design studio opens an expanded field of relations, plunging us into a churning subjective world rich in information that must be interpreted without our comforting frameworks of authority. It repositions the student in relationship to his or her work, the faculty in relationship to the student, and the studio problem in relationship to a web of human and environmental realities. Conducted as a shared enterprise among students, faculty members, and community members, the expert model that implicitly defines most studio work does not hold. The professor is not the atelier chief, nor is he or she the primary means of knowledge transfer, but rather a framer of questions and experiences, a convener and interpreter. The students are not lone authors of their individual works, nor are they uncritical exponents of received aesthetic values, but rather explorers, synthesizers, activists in creative problem solving. The design problem itself is not determined a priori, but constitutes rather a constellation of problems to be found within the social and physical environment and addressed within an inclusive definition of environmental design. Most importantly, the user, who in most architectural school projects is the eminence grise, now becomes multiplied as a polymorphous dynamic force. A community of would-be users and clients are respondents and creative participants with many voices. Both teachers and learners, they can show the students how to look, listen, and interrogate and fully use their agency as designers. Okay, So, yeah.
Before you move to the next topic, can you go a little bit further in the concept of engagement? Because this is the most troubling for quote-unquote newcomers to the field of service learning. What is the common ground? How do you engage on the boundaries?
Well, in this case, to tell a little bit of story about my own work, I've developed, and you mentioned it in the introduction, something called the Rust to Green Action Research Project. So we have a much larger framework for working with the community. We're working a lot in Utica, New York right now. So we've established partnerships with community organizations and groups, and we've established many of the sort of initial needs that have been identified with those community partners. So we're collaboratively undertaking a process of basically helping to develop strategies for the revitalization of one Rust Belt community, in this case, in upstate New York. So I've actually tied, in my case, my studio teaching and learning at the senior level and the graduate student level in the Rust to Green capstone studio to a much larger set of engagements that we're having in this particular community. So we've laid a groundwork. Community has identified needs. We've developed action steps that can be taken to start to address those. And we then start to connect some of the teaching and learning, such as the capstone studio. Some of my students are in that class here in the room. We're then connecting that teaching and learning to these larger community efforts. So in this case, we've got engagement happening at many levels, but critical, obviously, to engagement is partnership and mutuality and a common ground of determining how can local knowledge and academic knowledge and other forms of knowledge, professional, other knowledge, come together to collectively address and solve a problem. So this notion of partnership and mutuality, obviously mutual respect and exchange, is critical. I don't know, does that answer your question, or at least start to address it?
Partially, I should leave it.
For more things, yeah.
Actually, I have a slight follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
So this problem solving versus problem seeking is very interesting to me, because as people who don't necessarily live in that community, we're looking in and saying, here are problems. But that begs the question of valuation.
Mm-hmm.
Are what we consider problems perceived as problems within that community, and are what we value different? So how can we get around that? How can we make sure that what we value is what the community values, so that we can proceed forward rather than looking out and say, well, that's a problem, and the community itself is.
Absolutely. I think that's this critical concept of dialogic space, of creating ground for dialogue. And you can do that in a lot of ways. You can do that through meetings and through exchanges and coming together and defining problems, identifying, co-researching, using participatory action research methodology of actually co-researching problems together and beginning to hone in and identify them. I mean, we've just undertaken this large food project in Utica, New York, which started with it started with a fairly limited set of concerns, and one of those was just around one of the the cities with the highest poverty level in New York State. Food insecurity is a tremendous, issue, and it is a problem, food insecurity. But then, as we expanded over the last 2 years, we begin to see that that's tied to so many things. Food insecurity is also tied to, obviously, nutrition. It's tied to behaviors. It's tied to cultural practices. It's tied to availability of food. It's tied to even an understanding of sort of the planning practices at the level of, the agricultural landscape that are either preserving or sustaining or even supporting diverse agriculture economies. So that problem just keeps to expand out and be redefined and reassembled around a whole series of different understandings that have come out through the process of this much longer inquiry. So, I don't know if that answers the question, but even in the case of, in our, any students want to talk about our semester that we're having this semester, where we started out with 4 projects in Utica, and we think in many cases that you think you're honing in on what the problem is. This is just like balls up in the air all the time. What we, I think, mostly have been trying to understand is what is the nature of the problem. And when we look at some of the issues of the built environment, We immediately get drawn to issues of inequities in the environment. We get at social inequities. We get drawn to policy obstacles and issues. We even get drawn to sort of attitudinal narratives. You know, like that whole, this has been one of our big things in Rust to Green, is to try to shift the narrative from, you know, a negative one of hopelessness toward one of positivity and and change, that we could actually engage proactively in change. Does that kind of answer your question? But I think that is, it's a kind of a critic. Are you asking a question too? Yes.
Just to follow on that, how much of it is about a suspension of your own agenda as you go into the community?
A lot of it is about a suspension of your own agenda. I mean, I think that's very difficult because, again, if there's anybody who wants to be typed as creative visionaries, it's designers and artists. What else do they want? They want to be authors. I come from fine arts. You want to be the author, the sole author, the signature author. I did that. I'm the starchitect. That's mine. I can author it and stamp it. So, and we love that. And we educate actually to underscore and reinforce that. But what if I'm not the sole author? What if I'm a different type of individual? What if I'm a co-creator? What if I'm a facilitator? What if I'm a little bit of all those and a visionary? And I'm, not that one is more visionary than the other, but, changing my position of how I see myself. One of the things that I often think about as the most successful project is when I can see myself moving from the center to the edge. And things aren't conditional on my role. I have a part to play, but they're not conditional on my presence. And I think that can be a really important indicator of project success. And especially with design, when it starts to move from the individual-centered to the community-centered. And suddenly you see it's as a result of many coming together that happens. Is that okay? Well, and this is kind of a good segue into, I'd like to just read you a little bit from Jody Rios, because she was at University of Washington, St. Louis. She's now doing her PhD at Berkeley. And one of the things that she was really interested in is how do we bring dissimilarity together? How do we even recognize our dissimilarities? And this is one of the things that also happens here, and I think that's kind of what you were talking about before. How do you even know if you got the right problem, and how do you even recognize your dissimilarities? Because you come in thinking that's the problem. That also is a representation of maybe a representation of your authority, of your particular biases, of your particular way of seeing the world. So she's really has done quite a bit of work working with communities and recognized that students aren't able to see themselves in terms of what their value sets are and how those are dissimilar from those that they may be working with. Faculty don't necessarily see that either because we're so used to defining ourselves within that world. We don't even see how we're dissimilar. And community partners also frequently don't see how they're dissimilar. So they get mad and angry too. People get mad. I have this all semester. My students telling me, they don't get us. They don't understand us. Well, wait a minute. You may not understand them because you don't have the capacity to understand them. You're not listening through that lens. You're listening through your own lens, your own biases. So how do you start to unpack that? So she's developed a whole approach of trying to encourage radical openness in her students and in the community partners with whom she works and in herself. So I just want to read you a little bit about this because she's very influenced by Bell Hooks' work and also by Martin Luther King. So as I reflected on this experience, so she's talking a little bit about the failings of a lot of community engagement projects where her students are working with communities and we face this problem that we don't even know how we're different. We can't even understand how we're different. We think the community's different, not we're different. So and this again gets at all this sort of we, they. We do this all the time. So as I reflected on this experience and considered how the outcome might be different, so she's reflecting on these experiences and saying, well, how could it be different? She looked again to bell hooks' writing on cultural theory and transformational pedagogy, particularly her concept regarding a marginal space of resistance brought about by what she calls radical openness. This idea seemed to me the only way to describe what needed to happen in order for there to be any hope of bringing dissimilar people together in a meaningful way, or of envisioning Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s concept of the beloved community. What does it look like to be the beloved community that King imagined? Based on King's words, the beloved community is the aftermath of nonviolence that makes the struggle and resistance truly meaningful and transformative. It is a new relationship between oppressor and oppressed, based on reconciliation, redemption, and a love and hope that can transform oppressors into friends. According to King, love is inseparable from justice, and it is the basis for evaluating that which is transformed and that which is merely cloaked in rhetoric. And this is King being quoted. Therefore, the first hope in our inventory must be the hope that love is going to have the last word. According to King, the beloved community is both the location and the goal of transformative struggle, and any hope of creating and entering such a community requires love. The margin is the location of intimacy and perhaps another location of the beloved community and transformative struggle. This requires a different way of thinking about the meeting of disparate groups. Rather than speaking about bridging gaps or erasing boundaries between defined groups, let us consider a space in which the centrality of all actors is given up or denied by the individuals themselves. All become other in the marginal space, which thus erases the other and displaces the subject-object paradigm. So we all suddenly realize we don't know each other, we don't understand each other, we are all others. And that takes a big consciousness. This is not the same as the universalistic notion of synthesizing difference into a unified whole, because individual identity is understood and indeed necessary to this kind of engagement. Choosing the margin, as bell hooks points out, is much different from being placed in the margin. And I think that, Jodi's concept here, I think, is really important in terms of how do we start to recognize our dissimilarities and from there become empowered to change ourselves with and engage with others. We have to really change our position. This takes a lot of consciousness. And what she's done is, from all of her work, she developed a sort of 3-part sequencing with service learning courses, where she doesn't just put students into the community, like I've been doing in the Capstone Studio. But that's all I can do, given my curricular structure. But she basically developed a 3-sequence course so that students began to explore some of these issues of what they believe, their belief systems, what they don't know. What does community mean? Some of these concepts that we're hearing here. And then over time begin to start to emerge into the community engagement project, so that by the end they're actually doing a fully engaged studio. So this is her solution to kind of develop this building strategy. I now know that I cannot introduce service or design projects to students until they recognize the filters through which they see, understanding that they are in need of the people whom they wish to serve. In the same way, it is necessary for communities to recognize the possibility for attitudes to change and to value the necessity of their own role in that transformation. Author Bell Hooks reinforces this sentiment when she states that people of color who truly believe that white people cannot change can only embrace the logic of victimhood and anyone who denies that this change can happen is acting in collusion with the existing forces of racial domination. Communities that do not feel that such change has meaning to them will feel used when students enter their neighborhoods. Those that do will feel a sense of power. If students seek to serve without understanding the truth of their own accountability and do not embrace what they find, their work will be an exercise of domination. If the residents of these communities see only the truth of a dominant culture and do not open themselves to relationship and accountability in building bonds of trust through dialogue, then we are left with a false hope. Okay, how are we doing back there? You can see I marked way too many things to read. And that's only the first section about the other. But I'll just share a couple little highlights of different things, because we have a whole section on evaluation and reflection, and a couple of things. You know, we have a very well-known program for some of you who may know it, the SLARP program at the University of Illinois. It's called the East St. Louis Action Research Project. It started in the 1980s. You know, it's probably by now hundreds of students have actually gone from Champaign-Urbana to the African-American community of East St. Louis. And there was no evaluation of the impacts of that work on the student learning. And probably furthermore, at some level on the community too. I won't make all those claims. In this particular case, Lynn Dearborn set out to basically find out what some of those impacts were. So she developed a survey instrument. She's a professor of architecture, actually, University of Illinois. And basically, they studied from 1992 to 2003. They sought out over 500 alumni who would actually experience the SLARP program. And these are all students who are in planning, landscape architecture, and architecture. So they had gone and had some sort of SLARP studio or some sort of engagement in East St. Louis, but very little was known about the impact of this on their experience beyond a few stars. I mean, they found out about their star alums who went on to do interesting things and connected the dots and said, well, it's probably because they had the SLARP experience. So they actually did a whole research study to understand this and sent out surveys and followed up interviews and so on and so forth to actually understand the impacts. And they did find that, you know, that the SLARP experience did have an impact on students, and it particularly had an impact on some of the career choices that students made, some of the ways they went into practice. It also had an impact on how they thought of themselves as designers in the world, becoming better listeners. I won't read all these things, but becoming, you know, better listeners, beginning to bring some of the things they had done within that program into their professional practice life. Also, the idea of seeking out, you know, more interdisciplinary office type of environments where they would have more collaboration and exchange. So this was kind of significant too, because this is one of the big lacks or problems in our field, and even in the whole area of service learning, is getting some evidence of what the actual impacts of this kind of work are on folks as they go into their lives beyond academia. On the other hand, another colleague at University of Illinois actually undertook a study to see what kind of level of multicultural understanding emerged as a result of a one-semester interaction with a community in East St. Louis where they were actually developing a park design. So this was an interesting project. This is Laura Lawson, who's now at Rutgers. They teamed up with environmental psychologists, education psychologists, from University of Illinois, because again, they didn't feel equipped to actually measure or understand those impacts. So they brought other colleagues from educational psychology into their team. And those folks took on a process over the duration of the semester where they interviewed students pre their immersion, they interviewed them during the immersion, and then afterwards. And then they came up with a series of results. And it's very interesting because one of the big things that they found was that most of the learning occurred in terms of professional development. You know, learning how to draw better, learning how to public speak and things like that. And there was an indication of multicultural learning and development, but it was fairly limited. And in fact, many of the students, after their experience, maintained stereotypes, racial stereotypes, and biases, even after the experience, because the experience had not been tailored to really interrogating those issues, and really, well, it's not the only reason, but of also bringing that to light and constructing the kind of experience that would enable those issues to be discussed. So students weren't making the connection that, you know, you can't change overnight in a community that doesn't have the capacity to do that. They weren't making those kind of connections as a result of their immersion. So this has then helped to provide a better understanding of what kind of design of these interactions needs to occur. And this gets back down to, just to kind of sum this up, in terms of some of the disciplinary boundaries we're dealing with. Because you can say that you want to have these kind of collaborations with communities, that you want to have also collaborations across disciplines. And then you even might want to have disciplinary exchanges that involve people who have knowledge other than you. I mean, I'm not a sociologist. You know, I'm not an expert on issues that may be really germane or important to the kind of engagements that I'm undertaking. So who should be at the table? How should we have, you know, a collection or group of faculty and knowledges to the table to help us shape these interactions? So our colleagues at Michigan State actually propose in the end of this volume a new model from boundaries to synergies. They talk about it. And again, they describe the idea that within our disciplines, planning, landscape architecture, we're like this pizza, basically. Imagine this is the pizza. And there's 3 parts. And we're all in our separate realms. We're all separate disciplines. And that model of education where everything is a piece of the pie, it basically reinforces distance between us. It also makes us particularly ineffective in working with communities, because communities have complex problems that require us to come together to help identify, understand, and solve them. If we're just occupying our piece of the pie, then we're actually probably doing more disservice to those with whom we want to work than service. So they suggest a new model which starts to, starts to not see these individual pieces of the pie, but starts to see things as combining and working together across geographies. They call that the Synergies Model. I'm not going to go into the details, but I think, again, you know, they're identifying that until we sort of really start to look at the infrastructure of education and knowledge creation within our own fields, we're going to be severely limited in our capacity to effect the kind of educational transformations we want to effect, realize the full potential of design as engaged service learning or as engaged scholarship. So we really need to disassemble some of those structures, and that's the hardest part for any of us who've been part of academia for a long time, is that we are very much, and you know, and even in our own disciplines, and I know there's several disciplines from the built environment disciplines that are present here. As much as we want to behave differently, a lot of our structures reinforce our divisions. So we have a lot of work to do.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.